Hey everybody, welcome back to your Pro Tools lesson. My name is McKay Tebbs, and today we're going to be talking about Pro Tools 110 Lesson 8, more music making. I like to call this lesson the MIDI lesson or advanced MIDI things, or maybe not so advanced. It just depends on how far you take it, but it's more in-depth study and working in MIDI and instrument tracks in Pro Tools and the MIDI editor window and the score editor window. One of the coolest things we're going to do in this lesson is we're going to learn how to convert MIDI tracks to become audio tracks, and also how to convert audio tracks to become MIDI tracks, because you can go both ways. And we're going to be talking about that. We'll also talk about MIDI Merge and do a MIDI Merge demonstration. We'll talk about the track lanes and track views, the different MIDI editing windows, and then we'll also talk about how to navigate MIDI using the keyboard commands that you can use when you're doing that. So let's get to it. All right, so here is my Pro Tools session, and I have some tracks up here. These purple ones are all audio file tracks, and these two brownish ones are my instrument tracks. And one of the first things that I want to show to you is that in these instrument tracks, you have a track view selector where you can decide what you see on the tracks. Hopefully you've discovered this by now, but if you click on them, you have options, and it's different depending on what type of track you're clicking on. So I'm doing instrument options. So the instrument track options will be different from the audio track options and different from the MIDI track options as well. So this is an instrument track. Right now I have clips view on, which lets me see the clips as a whole. I could also go to notes view, and when I see that, I now see the MIDI tick notes in there. And if I want to, I can get my pencil tool over here, and I can start drawing MIDI ticks into the grid just by clicking with my pencil tool. So this is one place where you can do some editing, and you can edit right onto your MIDI tracks as right in the track itself, just by changing the view. So we have notes view. There's also velocity view. So just so you know, the velocity is the loudness of the MIDI note or the MIDI tick. So it has these velocity stems here, and if you click on them, you can drag them up or down. And when you do that, you're changing the volume of that MIDI tick or that MIDI note. If you drag it up, you're turning the volume up on that note. So sometimes MIDI notes can all be the same volume level, and that's kind of a bad thing if you're trying to make it sound realistic. So some people will edit their velocity stems so that some notes are accented and louder and some notes are softer. I know on drum beats, if you're doing eighth notes on the hi-hat, sometimes it's a really good idea to have every other eighth note be pulled down in volume so that there's kind of a breathing effect on the hi-hats to make them sound more realistic. And anyway, you can do that by pulling down their velocity stems right here. So this is the track view selector. So you can decide what you want to see here. There's also MIDI volume, and you have a volume line here where you can write automation for it. MIDI mute. You have a mute line here. So if you want a certain section to mute out, you can program that into it as well. What if you want multiple of these views at the same time instead of just one? Can you have that? Yes, you can. And the way you find that is by track lanes. Notice that down here in the left-hand corner, there's an icon for something. And if you push it, you can basically open up the track lane for any track. Every track has that track lane option. And so when you open up that track lane, you get to decide what you see down below the main track. So right now, my track lane has velocity view on it. So now I can come here to my track view selector, go back to notes view, and I can be working on the notes up here. And then down below, I can be adjusting their velocity. And notice that when you pick a velocity stem, it highlights the note that it's applying to up here, so you can see which one you're working on. You could also change your track lane to see any of the other things, like here's the MIDI volume. So now I just have the MIDI volume line down here, and then it's not on top of my notes here. Gives me another place to work in it. So remember your track lanes options as you're working with your MIDI in your edit window. Up here in the top of my session, I have my MIDI controls, and if you hover over them, it tells you what their name is. And let's talk a little bit about this one right here, the MIDI Merge. I'm turning it on and off. MIDI Merge is a really fun and cool way to record instrument tracks or MIDI parts. It allows you to build on your tracks one note at a time. You usually are going to be using it in conjunction with a loop play. So here I have loop play ready. And if you loop a certain section, you can basically loop it over and over. And every time it loops, when you record, you can add another note on top. One of the questions on the Pro Tools exam is, does it create a new clip every time it adds another note? And the answer to that is no. It's all within the same clip. So it's you create one clip, but you do it one note at a time. So I'm going to highlight the area where I want to do that right here. So I've made a selection. I've got my MIDI Merge enabled. I'm going to record ready the track. And now I'm just going to push the play button, and we're going to record in this section. And I'm going to record a G7 chord, one note at a time. Okay, we did it one note at a time, but the cool thing is it builds on itself. It plays all the other notes as you're recording the new note. So pretty soon you hear all the notes together. Let's try it again in the next bar. Let's go with the C major chord. I've got my MIDI Merge on. I'm going to push loop play and loop it around. I'm going to push record, and then we'll give it a try. All right, and there I have another chord created. Now you've got more than one finger, so usually when you're playing chords, it's really easy to just throw them down there, and you wouldn't necessarily want to record chords like this. But the idea is there, you know, and some people will use MIDI Merge for drum beats. And the first pass through, they're just doing the kick drums where they want the kick drums to be. The second pass through, they're doing the snare drums on the opposite beats where they want them to be. The next pass will do the hi-hats and so on and so forth. So you can use it as a fast way to create a MIDI part. And maybe it can make up for a lack of piano skills you do or do not have. You know, maybe you're not a great piano player, but you're just playing one note at a time. So MIDI Merge can be a great tool to use for those kind of things. Now let's talk a little bit about troubleshooting. Sometimes you're trying to work with MIDI and Pro Tools and it doesn't work. And why doesn't it work? So let's talk about a couple of reasons why. And the first thing I'll suggest that you double check and make sure is working is the MIDI Thru option. And that lives right up here in the options menu. So in this options menu, you have your options and there's a thing called MIDI Thru. You see how there's a check mark here? I have it check marked. Make sure it's always check marked. If it is, then your MIDI will come through. So just come up here and just always make sure that your MIDI Thru is checked and it's going to work for you. Another thing to make sure is checked is click. Do you see how it says click there? If you don't have your click checked, when you use your metronome, you're not going to hear it as well. So you need to make sure your metronome has the check mark there and your MIDI Thru has a check mark there. So you kind of ask yourself, why are these even here if you always want to be able to hear these things? And I guess sometimes in a recording studio, you might accidentally hit the keyboard keys while you're trying to play something back or record something, and you wouldn't want that to happen. So it's just a catch-all way to disable all MIDI right off the bat. I'm going to switch now to the MIDI Editor window. And in this window, there's a couple of things to check to make sure that your MIDI will work as well. And to get to this window, you're going to hit Control equals. So Control equals is the keyboard command to get you to your MIDI Editor window. Control equals, and that's what will get you there. So go ahead and try that a few times. I'm going to hit Control equals, and then I'm going to go Command equals. Command equals brings you back to your edit window. Command equals also toggles between the edit window and the mix window. Hopefully you know that one by now. But Control equals is for the MIDI Editor window. So in this window, it's important that in the left-hand side over here, you can't see it right now, but there's a tracks list, and I'm going to come over here to the right-hand corner and hit that arrow and just make sure that tracks list has a check mark by it. Now that I have it checked, I can see my tracks list here. This is not all the tracks in your session, but it is all the instrument tracks and MIDI tracks and aux tracks in your session. So not audio tracks, it's going to leave those out of there. But this could be part of the reason why you sometimes MIDI doesn't work in Pro Tools, and it has a lot to do with the gray dot. You see this gray dot right here? This gray dot is the MIDI track that you're working on, or the instrument track that you're working on. Notice that it's possible to have more than one gray dot selected. If you do not have that gray dot on the track you're trying to work on, you're not going to hear things from it. You're also not going to be able to edit it. Here's how you know what track you're editing. You have this handy-dandy little pencil tool here. That pencil means that's the track that's being edited right now. So if I come over here to my window and I look at these orange MIDI ticks, they are all part of my violin track over here. And underneath it, I can see their velocity stems. Now this is much better than the track view because now it's wider, it's its own window. Now it could be easier to write and create parts because it's just bigger in the window. Whereas the track view, when you see the MIDI ticks on there, and you go to notes view on there, you're probably just fixing one or two notes here or there that need to be fixed, and you're just going to fix them really quick. But this is where you'd want to do most of your editing at. Now, I have two instrument tracks here. I have violin 2 and pad 2. They're both instrument tracks. I'm going to turn them both on at the same time. And now you can see the MIDI ticks for both of those tracks together. So that's good. So this is basically my, all the MIDI information in my song. But the problem is they're all the same color and I can't see which track is which. And that's when you get these two buttons over here coming into play: color code MIDI note by track or color code MIDI note by velocity. These two buttons right here. When you click them back and forth, suddenly you can decide how you want to view your MIDI notes. So right here, I see there's green and orange. Guess what the orange ones are? Orange ones are my violin track. If I click on that button, they disappear. The gray dot makes them appear and disappear. So now I have separated the pad track. The green ticks are from the pad track, and the orange ones are from the violin. Now I see it all together, but I can see which one's which. And that, once again, is making them all the same color. So it's good to have this on when you're working with all of them, but truthfully, you're not going to need to work on both tracks at the same time. So you really probably just want to work on one track at a time. So you probably just want to view one track at a time. And that's what you can do right here. Now, there are some tools to be aware of when you're working in this MIDI editor window. You do have the record button, the solo button, the mute button. But what is this button right here? The notation display enable button. And if we click on that, it's going to open the notation view. So this will display the notation that the MIDI parts generate in your session. And if you want to turn it off, you just click on it again and you're back to the MIDI editor window. So you can click it back and forth. So the biggest thing you're going to be doing in here is using your pencil to create MIDI ticks, and you just click on it. Hold down Option and you can erase your notes. Option will erase them. And that's how you're going to get around in this window. But there's another way to work in this window. And I'm going to go back now to the edit window. And at the bottom here, you have three options, and you may not have noticed yet, but one of those options in the bottom left corner says MIDI Editor. There's MIDI Editor, Melodyne, Clip Effects, and you can click on each one of these to turn them on and off. Let's do it for the MIDI Editor. There's also a keyboard command to open up this MIDI Editor. They call this the Docked MIDI Editor because it's in your edit window. It's docked at the bottom. If you want to open it really quickly, you can do a triangle in your left hand. Control-Shift-Option equals. Have you noticed that equals button is all about windows, opening and closing windows? So there's a lot of different commands for the windows that use it. Control-Option-Shift equals. Just do that and go back and forth a couple of times. So what this docked MIDI editor window can do is it can allow you to work on a MIDI part briefly, just one track that's not too intense, because once again, if you're going to do a big overhaul on something, you probably want to be in the MIDI editor window for that. But you have a lot of the same controls and same options here. It's important to know that keyboard command, Control Option Shift equals. There's another MIDI window that we need to know how to use and how to open, and that is the score editor window. And you do that by holding Control Option equals. So here I'm just toggling back and forth, Control Option equals. I'm practicing for a minute. Go ahead and practice these commands. Control Option equals over and over. We'll open up the score editor window. Let's try Control equals. And now we get the MIDI editor window. And Command equals to go back to the editor window. Control Option equals opens up this score editor window. And this is a place where you can manipulate the score. Notice that it looks like a score, but there's some things you're going to need to do before you can get it ready to print. One of which is change the title and composer. Or what if you need to change the key and or the clef, the time signature? Remember, it's all by right-clicking onto the notation area. So I'm going to right-click. I'm going to get this these options here, and let's go to score setup. And I right-clicked, and now I have score setup. So in this, I can type my title of my song. And then I can type the composer name, me, and as soon as I do that, it immediately does that on the song, so you'll see it there. You can also decide if you want to display the title and composer or not. Do you want to display page numbers? Do you want to display chord symbols? So there's a lot of options here that you can decide that you want in your session. Now to control the more musical elements, like keys and time signatures, you need to right click and open up the notation display track setting. So here's notation display track setting. Now I can do things like change the staff, have a grand staff or just a treble clef or just a bass clef. I can change the key. I can decide the display quantization. I can customize those kind of things. And finally, when you've got your score ready, you can print it, or you can save it as a PDF. Once again, you're going to right click and you're going to go to print score. Then it opens up this box here where you can come down and go save as a PDF, or you could hit the print button. Another way to access that is by using the keyboard command, Command P for print. And when you go Command P, it also opens up that print box so that you can print from this area, from this window. All right, let's talk a little bit about conversion now. Converting MIDI files to audio files or instrument files to audio files, and also converting audio files into MIDI files. Wouldn't it be great if you worked really hard to record a guitar part, a real guitar, and then at the end you wanted a MIDI instrument to copy that, but then you have to go and write it out in MIDI? Wouldn't it be great if you could just copy and paste it in there? And basically you can, and you can do it with these tools. So let's start by getting this guitar part here, and let's change it into a MIDI part and basically an instrument track. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select the track I want to work on. One of the easiest way to do this is after you select, go up to the track menu, and in track there's this option that says extract MIDI to new track. So I have an audio track selected. I'm going to extract it, and it's going to convert it all to MIDI. So I'm going to select that. And now it's going to ask me things like, what kind of track do I want to select it? Do I want to create with it? So I want to use instrument. And this is kind of important. And it's kind of that elastic audio thing where it's going to analyze the notes being played. And you have to decide what's the best idea here. I happen to know that this guitar part is a melodic guitar part. And by melodic, I mean monophonic, like one voice. If it was a guitar part that was playing chords, like strumming chords, I'd probably want to use the polyphonic decay if it's strumming chords. But anyway, you have to decide what kind of part you have. I'm going to choose melodic for this, and then I'm going to push OK. And it takes a second to process it, but right after that, it creates that same guitar part, but now it's created as a MIDI part. Can you hear it yet? No, because in order to hear the MIDI, you have to assign a virtual instrument to it. So let's come over here to the insert, and let's get an instrument on there. And I'm just gonna choose vacuum, and let's see. Let me solo this guy and see what it sounds like. All right, so there I have it. I have a sound selected. Let's loop play and see what it sounds like. Okay, kind of a loud sound, a little bit harsh. Here it goes again. Let's, just for fun, now let's see what that sounds like with the real guitar track that was recorded. And let's hear both of them together and see, see how in sync they are with each other. So I'm going to solo that guitar track and push play. All right, so anyway, hooray, it worked. So we converted the audio track into a MIDI track. And to me, that's a really cool effect. It's also a time saver because I could have, wrote that all out with MIDI. I could have clicked it all in, but that's going to take a good hour or so to try. And then to rhythmically try and match it, that could be another challenge when you're writing out MIDI. So it's so cool that you can do this. So let's do it the other way now. And this other way works both ways. What I'm about to show you, I guess what I'm about to show you could work with MIDI to audio conversions and audio to MIDI conversions. And the other way is to just create an extra track. So let's come back to this guitar track here, and I'm just going to create a new track. I'm going to create an instrument track. I'm going to make sure it's a stereo instrument track. And there we go, stereo instrument track. I'm going to push create. So now I've got it. So this other way to convert is to just drag and drop. So let's go ahead and drag it and drop it and see what happens. And I get this box opening up. Once again, asking me the conversion type. Should I use melodic? And I am going to use melodic, so I'll just keep it as that, push OK. And now I have created it again. So I can copy this vacuum plugin and put it there, and now I have the same thing created. So dragging and dropping onto the track you want to convert it to can be another way to do it. Let's do it the opposite way now. Here I have some MIDI tracks, some instrument tracks already created. Let's go ahead and create a new audio track. And I'm going to make this a stereo audio track and I'll put it right there. So I've got this violin part here, this MIDI violin part. So I dragged it and dropped it, and now it's bouncing, and you see this bouncing thing down there, or in other words, it's converting. And now I have it as an audio track, a real audio track. You can see the waveforms right here. And so you can see the waveforms right there. But anyway, does it sound the same as the violin track? Actually, yeah, it's going to sound exactly the same. But it's important to remember that conversion is kind of a misnomer name when you're doing it audio to MIDI, because what you're really doing it is rendering it, and that's where your rendered files folder comes in. And so it's basically having the MIDI notes trigger the sound that you have attached to that first instrument track, and it's just recording what's there with the sound that's there. But it's an actual audio file track. And this can be an effective thing to do if you're sharing your sessions with friends or instructors like me, and they might not have your plugins. So you could do this, and then the plugin's going to be built in. The audio track's going to sound like what it's supposed to sound like without the plugin on there. So it can be very effective for that. All right, and the last thing we're going to talk about is how to navigate in the MIDI editor window. I'm going to go back there for just a second. So here is my MIDI editor window, and here you can see I have a bunch of MIDI ticks. I can click on them and they become highlighted when they do that. I want to teach you the tab trick. I'm going to push the tab key now with that one note highlighted. And notice that when I do that, you see the edit cursor move to the right. So tabbing can move the cursor from note to note. It might look kind of random right now, but if I zoom in a little more, you'll see that it's moving from the beginning of one note to the beginning of the next note. So remember that you can tab. If you're trying it and it's not working, then you need to come back here to the edit window and just make sure that your tab to transients button is turned on. If your tab to transient button is turned off, then you're going to tab to the clip end and clip beginnings, not the note end and note beginnings. So make sure you got tab to transients turned on, and then you can tab around these things. But as you may have guessed, you can select a note, and then on your keyboard, you can use these arrows to navigate things too. So I'm going to go right arrow, and as I do that, the note I select goes to the right, and I'm going to go left arrow, and now the note I select goes to the left. So this can be a time saver when you're getting around things. Another thing you can do once you got that going is you can use the up and down arrows. So I've got this last note selected. I'm going to move it up. You see it moving up, and here's back down. So you can move a note that's already there. They call that chromatic nudging. Technically, we're nudging the notes with these arrow keys. And when you nudge up and down, it's doing it chromatically because there's 12 notes in an octave, and it's taking each one of those 12 notes incrementally. Wouldn't it be nice to do that within the key itself? And that's where some of these modifier keys in here come in handy. So if you hold down the control key while you're using those up and down arrows, then you will be diatonically nudging. Diatonic is a fancy word that means in the key of. So whatever key your song's in, instead of going to those chromatic notes that aren't in the key, hold down control and nudge, and it will go to your diatonic. Now, when I hold down control and nudge, it does this. It shows me all my windows simultaneously. That's because I need to go into my Apple preferences and rearrange some things, but control and the arrows are how you diatonically nudge. If you hold down shift, you do this cool thing called transposing by octaves. So you have a note here and you can transpose it up and down. So I'm holding shift and holding the arrow up. Now I just jumped that note up an octave. Now I just jumped that note back down. So shift in the arrows is the octave key. Option in the arrows is the duplicate key. So if you hold down option and then push the up arrow, it duplicates it. Now the original note stayed there, and I'm just adding a bunch of notes right on top of it. But option could be handy. What if you want to duplicate a note an octave higher? Can you hold down option and shift together? Yes, you can. Now I duplicated that note up an octave higher, so the original notes are still there as I was doing that. So anyway, it's important to know those modifier keys when you're working in the MIDI edit window and what they do. All right, thank you for coming to my video today and for watching this Pro Tools demonstration. Good luck with Pro Tools 8. I hope you're going to have a good time studying it and learning it and getting all these keyboard commands down. And remember, when you do that exam, that the keyboard commands are a big part of it. So you're going to need to have them memorized, basically. But anyway, I'll see you in the next video.